Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Executive, a place where entrepreneurs, operators, and investors share their advice and life lessons on how to make it at the highest level. Today, I'm joined by Jen Farmer, the Chief Marketing Officer of Neat Capital, which is a venture-backed fintech company headquartered in Boulder, Colorado. Jen, so great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Well, you're now the Chief Marketing Officer. Would love to hear about your background a little bit. What got you into marketing to start with?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a funny question I'm asked pretty often. And the answer is that it was an accident, really. I was an English major, graduated in college during the last big recession. And so there were no jobs anywhere at first. And I knew I was good at a couple things. I was good at writing, I was good at storytelling, and I was good at analytics. Because strangely enough, I was also a pre-med major before I was English. So I kind of always liked math, I like science, and I like storytelling and writing. And I kind of happened into marketing by accident, and had always had this idea that marketing and business was for someone who is very extroverted. And since I'm introverted, I'm like, oh, that might not be a fit. But I kind of started that job anyway. And from there, kind of my career took off. And so it is kind of funny that I say it was an accident out of, in some ways, desperation when I was trying to figure out what kind of job can I have with an English degree. So I don't have to live on my parents' couch after college. And so definitely a happy, universe kind of thing happening back in 2007.
Well, it's interesting that you noted storytelling and how that could, a lot of English majors learn how to storytell really well, and how much of that is in marketing and sales. It's really about storytelling. So I never thought of the two, being so close in sync.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that stood out to me when I was reading job descriptions for marketing and positioning the brand for your audience. And I did things both in marketing and sales. I would support the sales team at my first company. And I realized, like, you're trying to convince someone of something pretty early on, or educate them. And so having that really strong writing and communication foundation really helped me just get to know the industries I was in and like how to best tell those stories in more complicated fields. So, yeah.
And it sounds like you used some of those skills. You were employed before Neat Capital. You're employee number 3 at Pi Insurance, which just saw massive growth. Went from, your employee number 3, now it's over 350 people over just a few years. They raised a massive Series C as well. What did you, learn from that experience and being part of the growth there? And what lessons did you're taking now into Neat Capital?
I mean, Pi really stood out to me early on. It had a couple of things really going for it, even before it really launched. So, one, when I got on the phone with John Swigert, the CEO, the company had a really unique set of underwriting data that illustrated a huge problem in the small business space, especially when it came to workers' comp insurance. And businesses were being charged or overcharged as much as 30%. And so, helping small businesses that were struggling have a cheaper monthly payment or whatever payment for those kind of required insurance needs. It wasn't the hardest message to market. And so that part was kind of checked.
Savings.
Had a strong value prop. But the other thing was that we had a very experienced founder. So like I said, John Swigert, he was very instrumental in building out Esurance that was sold for over $1 billion. And it's also rare to join a startup where the CEO believes in marketing, because he was the CMO of Esurance for a decade. And so it was a very unique role to be not only employee number 3, but the first marketing hire. And so we hadn't yet raised our Series A at Pi when I joined. We had, some seed money. We hadn't even brought workers' comp to the market yet. We were still, I think, 6 months out from that. And so when I joined, it was really to set the foundation for growth. So that way we can implement some initial strategies, channels, get a sense for messaging and what would work early on before we could launch in a market. And it was great because early on, I was working with John kind of around the clock. It'd be like Sunday morning looking at Google ad like metrics together. It was definitely around the clock, very exciting time because John was so great at understanding marketing, the levers to pull, but also knowing that we ultimately needed to find that lowest cost possible for a client. So that way he can also help and raise Series A on some of that information. So, I definitely learned a lot coming out of that, whether it's how to test concepts, messaging, audiences as quickly as possible. I came from a larger Fortune 500 company where when you put together an ad campaign, it usually lasted for the year, whether or not it was successful. And so it was so refreshing putting together some ads and being able to hit delete the next day if they weren't effective. Right. And that kind of gave you a whole new sense of power of you don't always have to do something because you poured your time into it if it's not working in the end. And so it helped me kind of disconnect from some of the work I did and just kind of objectively see, is it working? Is it not working? With always that kind of eye towards, can this scale at cost?
Yeah, and with startups, right, you don't have the luxury of time or the money to keep putting money into those ads, right? So you got to figure out quickly, is this working or not?
Right.
So you're now with Neat Capital as the Chief Marketing Officer, and Neat Capital is doing a lot of amazing things in home lending and just the application process. Love to hear what got you excited about Neat Capital, what work you're doing, and then we could love to also talk about the Series B also that you just raised.
Sure. So the CEO of Neat Capital, Luke Johnson, funny enough, our paths crossed in our former kind of business lives. So when I was working for that larger Fortune 500 company in healthcare, we targeted a lot of hospital and health system CEOs, as well as some M&A groups. And Luke was actually on that side of the business. And so many years ago, I did this pretty successful direct mail campaign where you opened the piece and a video started playing. Well, apparently it landed on Luke's desk. I guess he must have been on the mailer list. And he kept that. He thought it was so cool. He kept that with him, he said, for a very long time. I don't know if he really kept it for years, like he said, but, and it wasn't to use my company, but it was to hopefully steal my marketing idea because he's like, oh, this is great. And so when we didn't realize that until the interview. And when we did, it was like, wow, not only is he creating a really interesting, useful company that's really needed in the home lending space, but, it's just kind of nice that, our lives had crossed a long time ago. And I always take those types of signs as a, fate. So, right. But, Neat Capital is doing some really impressive work in the mortgage space. I'm not just saying that because I'm their CMO, but the housing market, I think everyone knows is the hottest it's really ever been. And so in a strange way, the traditional pre-approval process is actually dead, or that's kind of how I see it. It's dead because there's so much competition on each house that you can't just have a quick pre-approval anymore to win bids on homes. And so I didn't know that was going to be the case in 2022 when I joined Neat 2 years ago. But this high pressure environment is really where Neat shines as a mortgage lender, because everyone else in the industry still uses the same tech from the 90s. And they still take over a month, usually 40 to 50 days to close on a home loan. And, two things people really need right now, not only in Colorado, but pretty much everywhere I look, is speed and having the strongest possible offer. And so, since Neat has its own mortgage tech, we really can give clients the ability to upgrade in both areas. So we can close loans 3 times faster. I've seen loans close on average of 15 days, but I've even seen random loans be closed from locked to close in 9 days. And people, are writing a ton of reviews right now about how critical that was for them in this competitive market. And the other thing that our tech does, which I always saw it as a value prop years ago, but now it's so critical that as we launch some new advertising coming up this summer, that's going to be a major message. And that has to do with our platinum approval. So what's a platinum approval? In some ways, the key message here is that, like I said, a pre-approval is pretty much dying, if not dead. And so because we have our own tech, because it underwrites and prices loans automatically, and then once that kind of goes through our system and into our underwriter's actual hands, we can fully underwrite a home loan in 24 hours, which means if you're bidding on houses, you can get a fully underwritten approval at the start of your home buying journey. So that way, when you put a bid on a house, you're not having to check that box that says you're contingent upon financing. That's it. The only other people who don't check that box are people with cash. So you suddenly now have an offer above almost everyone else there. Plus, you can also tell people you can close in 2 weeks. So what's better than saying you're not contingent on financing and you can close in 2 weeks? And that's really helped people get through the noise on these houses that they want, and compete with cash buyers, really.
That's incredible. So in this market, right, you list the house maybe Thursday, Friday, get offers that weekend, and then you make a decision on Monday. So now you can look at a house on a Thursday, or let's say you look at a house even on Friday, be pre-approved by Saturday when you need to make the offer, and they make a decision on Sunday, and you're going to close in 2 weeks.
Right, exactly. And just, and to be clear, like the pre-approval that normally people just get offline in like 2 minutes, at this point, those things don't matter as much as someone who is either fully underwritten already. And that's a question that some of my friends, even who are buying houses right now, that was a question that a lot of people ask is like, well, is your loan like fully underwritten and approved, or is it just like a pre-approval letter? Because at this point, there's usually so many bids that unless
it's a big difference.
It's in the bank, like it's too risky for them. So they're just going to go with either cash or at least something that's cash-like, which is what Neat can offer at least.
That's awesome. Well, clearly you're getting a lot of traction. You just raised your Series B1 from Forecast Labs, a Comcast Venture Group. Tell us about that, because it's not a traditional Series B, right? There's some sort of partnership involved in that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately Forecast Labs they call themselves like a startup studio that uses kind of a one-of-a-kind CPA-based TV advertising to drive customer acquisition. Their vision is to kind of lessen the dependence on other channels like social media and paid search, and use their relationship within Comcast to have TV ads running on behalf of the companies that they serve. So starting this month, Neat Loans is going to be on TV commercials around the country. So that was a project I just finished up, making a bunch of different commercials to test. So that's very exciting. And Forecast Labs has kind of famously done this model with other big companies that people probably have heard of. Acorns, FabFitFun, tongue twister, Hippo, Instacart.
Hippo Insurance.
Hippo Insurance, Instacart, which is huge, especially with the coronavirus. And so we're really excited to start this journey with them, because they just know how to grow and partner with companies and startups to make them kind of go from a small no-name brand to something that everyone knows who they are. So, definitely a very exciting phase of growth coming with Neat.
That's really exciting. And as the Chief Marketing Officer, where you're at this point of growth, right? And you talked about Comcast, being part of that and his partnership. Where else are you putting these dollars to? Like, where are you seeing the most effective channels to really advertise or, get brand recognition?
Even when I'm in CMO roundtables and talk with my peers, it really just, it differs based on industry, audience, message, and ultimate your conversion goals. Yeah. And so, we have had a lot of luck at Neat and paid search, for instance, because mortgage is very competitive. There's so many people out there, from banks to fintechs to more traditional lenders, who not only have awareness, but have reach. And there's just so many national, local, regional players that getting in front of people who are actively searching for a pre-approval or a home loan and like more transactional keywords was really helpful for us, because then we can, really at least get in front of people when they're seriously looking for that, first step in the process, or even maybe, further down step in the process. So that was a huge success for us. We also did see some success on radio as well. And maybe
still works.
Yeah, exactly. We had great success at Pi with radio too, which is why I also wanted to try it here. And I think there's a difference in radio. It's not always about like, hey, stop what you're doing and get mortgage pre-approved. But Neat is unique, and it allows us to have a different kind of message where we're not just like marketing on who has the lowest rate. We are uniquely different. We allow more competitive bids. We are faster. And then we also have a smart application where you can do tax analyses and breakdowns and figure out, like, ultimately, without a person trying to skew you one way or the other, what is the best mortgage products for your goals long-term financially, especially if you ever intended to like take, have a lower payment or save money and then take that savings and put it into some other investment strategy. And so, Neat really likes to own the term mortgage strategy because, it is a huge debt on your balance sheet. And, we partner with a lot of people who help wealth managers, and we're more collaborative in talking through what makes sense. And so that kind of message on radio did really well because people don't often hear a mortgage company talking about your financial strategy versus, hey, get a quick low rate today. Not that we don't have low rates, but that's not necessarily the only
classic ad. Yeah.
Exactly. And then, so those have been successful. TV is a great medium. We're lucky to be part of this partnership because TV is traditionally expensive to break into. And so knowing like what channels to be on, what markets to be on is a lot of work. And so this partnership does give us, that advantage. In other companies, when it comes to, which marketing channels are most effective, going back to the direct mail piece that Luke had, that he had, from years ago that he remembered me from, we were reaching out to hospital CEOs, traditionally men in their 60s who ran healthcare systems. So deploying cash against Instagram and social media didn't really make sense. And really Google Ads wasn't effective either because they usually did delegate those tasks elsewhere. And so that was really a different audience bucket for us regardless. And so to really hit them directly, they're really only in two places, at their office, at their home, which we're not going to market to their home, and conferences or trade shows. And so to get to their office, you had to pass like the ultimate security, which is their admin. And so we had a lot of strategies to not just send like mailers, but to send like, hefty boxes and hefty things that like would at least get the admin to think, oh, this looks pretty important. We should give it to the CEO, or maybe I can open it first and then give it to him. And so it was just very different having direct mail and even trade show or conference strategies versus Pi, which was not going that route at first. I do know Pi is at trade shows now for the B2B strategy because I see them on LinkedIn or posting, which is exciting. But yeah, at Pi it was things you could test faster: SEO, SEM, paid social, and really optimize from there. And we were optimizing hourly. Like we weren't like waiting even a full day sometimes to make a change or to kill a campaign, which again, I was not used to that kind of speed. I was used to let it run for a year and then next year we'll try something different. So it was exciting. It was also kind of scary of like, oh, do I have enough intel to know I should turn this off? But it was useful.
And it sounds like you're, with a lot of this, you're really targeted, right, to, who your customers at the end of the day. But you said something that was interesting on the radio is that you're almost just keeping you in mind, right, when that they do need a mortgage, right, and which is brand. And, brand is a really wide topic, but when you think of a brand and how to create one, how do you go about that? Like, how do you go about and create the brand recognition that you want?
Sure. I mean, I think this goes back to, whether you're in a growth organization or you're running a department in a major brand, let's say, major organization that's well known. I think ultimately the first thing that matters most, and I'm sure we can have a ton of debate on this in the CMO community, but messaging is so critical because in my opinion, what I've said to my teams, you could have the prettiest ad, the, nicest graphics, the best marketing budget and the best channels. But if you don't have a strong message, then you're not going to get very far if you can't, boil things down into simple, compelling thoughts. And so to me, that testing that message. So like if you're a big brand, you probably know what messages win, and just kind of staying in those lanes is one thing, and keeping the brand solid based on those messages is important. And if you're new, it's really important as fast as possible to test out very extreme messages to nail down which ones resonate the most. So even at Pi, we had various people think different things. So to recap, at Pi, it's workers' compensation insurance. It's for small businesses. And there's, many ways that other companies in the space have marketed to businesses. And sometimes it's like fear-based where it's like, don't let your employees get hurt and then you get sued or all that kind of scare tactic. Then there's more the feel good, like, don't you want to keep your employees safe and happy messaging? Then you have like savings messaging, very Geico or, save 20% or 30%.
What worked best?
For us, it was savings. People like savings. And so that works. And so, yeah, coming up with that right away and then going pretty deep on that message, maybe a second message if there's ever some sort of tie is definitely the most important things to get right early on. Or even if you're kind of getting into a new company and it seems kind of fragmented, just having that right will kind of set everything else up.
And how do you tell what messaging is working? Do you have just test groups, or how do you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, you can test it in various places. Sometimes the fastest ways to test might be like paid social, for instance, because you can kind of run a campaign to a lot of people and just kind of get a sense of what is converting. Yeah. My main recommendation, though, is not to keep the messaging too similar. So you do want to have, especially at first, very different messages that you're testing to get an overall feel of tone, like which tone and message are they leaning towards most often? And then in the analytic, basically you're just saying who's clicking on it. And if you can even get deeper and say who's actually converting on that message, then that's more ideal, not just clicks. Then you can start cutting the ones that are not working and then go deeper on maybe the two that did win and then start cutting again what's not winning. And, at Pi, I think we only went through maybe a couple of week process where we quickly figured out it's really dramatic results on our side to know, okay, this one's winning and here's a second best kind of message. But, using paid social is one probably good way to get some results because then you can go into testing visuals after you're done with messaging.
Yeah. It's really interesting. We're a lot of startups on this podcast, right? And it's just, failing fast, trying to figure out what works quickly, really, more so than failing fast. But marketing seems like that on steroids, where you're just so quickly trying to figure out what works and just testing constantly, just like you are on the larger scale with a startup.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if larger scale companies start kind of taking that approach too. At some point, certain companies reach a plateau in growth, and you don't want to overestimate certain things like that. So, having a testing approach, or even if they call it almost like a marketing R&D channel, where they're allowed to kind of break some brand rules maybe and test new things out, wouldn't be so bad. Just kind of take that approach from startups who have grown tremendously.
Or it's clearly working. Yeah. Well, we talked about, what works in marketing. What are some of the big mistakes people make with marketing?
There's so much data that comes into the marketing team. And it's very easy to make strategic decisions based on that marketing data alone. Especially if you're in a very siloed role. I've seen that before where you say, okay, I'm marketing and I'm going to care about my marketing data. And then the salesperson worries about his sales data or her sales data and so on. I'm uniquely in a position at Neat where I own not only marketing, but I run inside sales as well. And so to me, I kind of have a good example of this. I had a junior person on my team who helped me run Google Ads. And one day he came to me super excited that he found like a market where we got the cheapest cost per conversion that we've ever seen. And it also gave us a lot of volume. So it seemed like a magical place that he found, like a magical state to market in. And we're like, wow, this is amazing. But before I didn't want to be a naysayer, but before I said, yes, let's pour tons of money into this campaign, I went into my sales data and I wanted to see the quality of the leads because there are certain quality factors that can make a lead dead on arrival and we can't do anything with them anyway. And 100% of those leads were dead on arrival due to that quality factor in their information.
Or they wouldn't qualify for the loan.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Like it'd be impossible. So, so instead of doubling down on that campaign, we pulled it. We didn't do it anymore. And so, that was my example to him that yes, we might find places where conversion is amazing, where volume is amazing. It doesn't always mean that it's going to be amazing through the funnel. And so I think having a bigger view of your funnel and I learned this at Pi as well, is like everything we did in marketing, even on Facebook, was always tied to a quote. And then if someone actually got a policy. So
right. Marketing tied to sales.
Right. Yep. And thinking about that very, very end goal. And what does that cost for a client? So that's the other thing too, is like, if you can at least understand what your maximum cost for a client is, you see what your conversion is along the way, you either know you're going to get there or you're not. And you can make some changes based on that. So that's definitely something that people don't always think about cross-functionally.
Right. And that's where you got to remember, at times where marketing is truly meant to lead into sales, not just to have everybody know about you, but you don't get any more sales from it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about you for a bit. You've had a really quick rise to being a CMO in your career. What do you attribute, that to?
It's funny that I was and still am an introvert. I was the type of person who couldn't give a class presentation without the room spinning and going dark. It's strange that I found myself in a CMO role by 35. But I guess if I break it out, I would say early in my career, I rose from being the entry-level person on the team to the head of marketing in about 5 or 6 years because I was involved in everything. Now, there are some dark sides to this, including burnout. I was working 80 to 100 hours a week. I was just so invested in my career and the company. And I was the type of person who didn't want to let people down. So there are some dark sides to that, of course, with boundaries and all that. But, I didn't really know much about boundaries back then. I didn't know much about burnout until it hit me. But that, in some ways was a blessing because I was involved in writing sales proposals. I was involved in direct mail. I was involved in, we had a big process improvement team in that corporation where since we employed a lot of physicians and anesthesiologists, I would get to go and go to the hospitals, do case studies with them, even see surgeries in action, which was pretty cool. And so I just became kind of the go-to person for literally everything. And so when we merged with a bigger company, my knowledge and history was so deep that, I just ended up leading more and more teams once we had, I think over the couple of years in the future, went through 2 major mergers. And instead of being one of the people cut, there's always people cut in mergers. Luckily, because of my depth of knowledge and all the relationships I had built in that company across departments, I was always kind of luckily not only staying in my role, but being promoted to handle more and more stuff. And so joining Pi was a risk because in my head, it wasn't a stable Fortune 500 company. It was just a startup with some seed cash. But I didn't want to focus on my title and things like that. I did see it as a learning opportunity. I mean, I was very intrigued by the CEO. He's one of the smartest people I know. He's one of the smartest marketers I know. And I just knew that I would learn so much, and I love learning in general. So I was like, you know what? I'm gonna leave the stable Fortune 500, go to the startup, and everything I learned at Pi, all that rapid testing we talked about, the metrics, really thinking about that cost per end user, those were things that were never discussions in that larger company that could spend money on NASCAR or could spend money on a PGA tour, and they weren't ever really tracking it down to a relationship. And so it kind of filled out maybe some gaps in my own expertise. And Luke saw that right away when he brought me in as their VP of marketing initially. And I got really involved in that group, and in more places I had gaps. So I spent a lot of time in board meetings doing presentations. I helped Luke with fundraising conversations. I also volunteered to take on inside sales when that was starting. And I really just get involved as needed. If I see a problem, I'm not the type of person to ignore it and say it's not my issue. So I help out with some B2B things. I help out with some process improvement stuff. And that really led me to where I am today.
Right. You have no job description, it sounds like. Whatever is needed, you're going to take that on and learn anything you can and then take risks like you did with Pi and, onto a new venture if Neat.
Yeah, I really did learn that from my dad. I mean, my dad's a firefighter and was a firefighter for his whole career. But when he got home from his shift, he would go to a ton of odd jobs. And so I used to go with him. And so whether it was painting a school during the summer break, and I was pretty petite, trying to do the rolling of the paint myself too. Yeah. But I just saw that he was always there to help, always there to, whether it was helping someone in the fire department or helping someone do a task. I always saw that in him, and it was nice to kind of experience that. And that kind of led me to do the same thing in my jobs.
That's really cool. But I do want to ask too, because you mentioned it, how do you now, having burnt out in the past, still put in the same amount of intensity or close to and avoid burnout now? How have you learned to avoid that?
I think just self-awareness. In the past, I didn't know that I was feeling burnout until it was very late I even got pretty sick too, from not eating well or eating like only fast food and not drinking water and just like pounding down Coca-Cola or sodas and like, I don't know, all that kind of stuff. So now that I'm aware, I can kind of sense at least like if I'm getting, if I need like an afternoon, I may not be the best example of someone who takes breaks or vacations. So I do need to get better at that. But, usually for me, at least, I can take a pretty small break or I can take an afternoon off and feel recharged again for that next day, which, luckily balances out all the things I need to do. But I think it's just self-awareness. I think therapy is good too. Talking through things and how you perceive other things can also just be a good practice.
Yeah, that's great. And you touched on this a little bit, but what are some, habits or practices that you've really, instilled in your life that have really served you well in your career?
I think it is just like being helpful, getting to know a lot of people, getting involved in projects that are outside of your scope of work. I tend to do it out of curiosity and just like being helpful. And so I think as long as you go into it that way, you're not trying to I think some people might try to get involved in things and other people feel like, oh, he's trying to take my job or he's trying to tell on me. I feel like when I do it, I usually get pretty accepted into things because I'm just either advocating for the people who are struggling in a role, or I'm just trying to find ways to make their job easier or understand a process. And I think that's just so critical, that kind of, networking and it can even be outside of your job as well, like through other companies and other organizations that you're part of, just to get to know people without like a lot of, I guess like without an angle, just like doing it because you want to know them or you want to help them without anything in return.
That's great advice. As we wrap up, what, is there a book? It could be a marketing book. It could be just a book you love. Like, do you have a favorite book that's really served you well?
So yes, my favorite book, and all my friends know this because they usually give me little trinkets and stuff over the years, is The Little Prince. So it's known as but
I wasn't expecting that one.
Yeah, I think it's a book for adults. I read it for the first time as an adult. And so anyone listening who is an adult and who's not Prince, it will probably take you an hour or two. I don't know, it depends on how fast you read. It has pictures in it. But when I read that at the end of college, it just was one of those very impactful stories about friendship, about loss, about connection. And I found it very moving.
I love that. What about a favorite quote? Do you have a favorite quote?
I do. So I actually have this quote on my Twitter profile. And I think back to it every so often, but it's by Gertrude Stein. And she said, if you can do it, why do it? And I think that's interesting to think, when I make decisions, do I do things because I can and it's easy? Or do I pursue things that I think I can't do, but I want to do? And so it's kind of it's almost like one of those quotes you have to read over a few times. Like, if you can do it, why do it? But
very thought provoking.
When it strikes down, it's why are you only doing things that you think you can? And I think some people limit themselves when they only stick in a lane that they're like, oh yeah, I can do this, but I can't do that. And a lot of those self-limiting beliefs are just things that you maybe have internalized or repeat to yourself that aren't necessarily true. And so that's kind of how I go about my career and my life in general.
Yeah, it makes sense for you too, given, where you see gaps, you just dive in and try to fill those gaps and learn. To close us, do you have any parting advice, for fellow CMOs, aspiring CMOs, and people in marketing in general?
Sure. We're in a kind of crazy world, I feel like, right now. And a few people recently have asked me, isn't it risky to be working for a startup? And in my career, I've seen risk kind of be equally spread amongst whatever company you work for. And so, yes, a startup is risky because you also have more transparency. You can see that you have limited cash. You might have lots of burn. You might have a plan ahead towards growth and raising more money. But sometimes it could be scary when it's so visible in front of your face. And what I don't think people always know is that in big corporations, they might be having similar conversations or strategic decisions or mergers that will also affect people's stability in their roles. And so when I was at my large Fortune 500, we merged and had acquisitions so often that I feel like at one point, it was almost like every few months we had to decide who was staying, who was going, and it was very stressful. And so I actually found way more stability in a startup where at least I know, here's how much money we have, here's how much money we need, here's what we need to get that money. And you can kind of at least see that's happening. And that kind of stuff is all behind closed doors in those larger organizations. And so really everything's a risk, I say. Align yourself to your vision for what you have for your life. Understand your core values, and then really make your career decisions from there.
That's awesome. And you've aligned yourself with great people in both Pi's former CEO and now Luke. So you've got a great team.
I agree.
Jen, thanks so much. This was fun, and I really appreciate you taking the time for this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.